We therefore wondered whether there was a policy zeitgeist associated with postmodernity that could be invoked to explain such similarities in the absence of evidence of direct linkages in advance of the policies emerging in both places. I'm not going to repeat at any length what we concluded in that paper, but it was summarised by Stephen Ball, the journal's guest editor on that occasion, as saying, "Whitty and Edwards argue that proposals and justifications for reform in one country provide resources for advocates and politicians interested in promoting change in others. This is not so much a matter of policy exchange, but the reinforcement of shared assumptive worlds." Although we did not refer to it at the time, our analysis has something in common with Sabatier's advocacy coalition framework. And our paper was also, I think, an example of what Gita Steiner-Kamsi calls an analytical rather than a normative approach to the study of policy borrowing. In other words, not a paper saying about what should happen, but a paper trying to understand how this process works. And the same is true of today's lecture, at least until just towards the end. Steiner-Kamsi herself writes cogently about the reasons for policy borrowing, but particularly between rich and poor countries in the context of international aid. One of the things that's puzzled me has been why there's been a US-UK nexus in education policy reform that has extended well beyond the close political ties of the Reagan-Thatcher era. It's not apparently been linked to aid, nor is it an obvious example of what's come to be called PISA tourism. The rise in the importance of PISA league tables in education policy discourse has certainly been significant. It's rare to hear a speech on education by a British politician without reference to England's place in those league tables. Colleagues at Edinburgh University have undertaken a research project looking at the role of international comparison surveys and how they are increasingly dominating education policy. They found that both policymakers and the media, in their words, unequivocally accept PISA and other OECD research findings with little critical interrogation or further exploration. PISA results and others, they say, have become an event no one can afford to miss. It requires answers and demands action. And even here in the USA, and the pressures of globalization and the need for a competitive workforce mean that OECD data feed into President Obama's rhetoric. For example, in his introduction to a blueprint for reform, he talks about world-class education in these terms, similar to the ones that Geoffrey Canada just mentioned. He says, today, more than ever, a world-class education is a prerequisite for success. America was once the best educated nation in the world. A generation ago, we led all nations in college completion, but today, 10 countries have passed us. Now, one impact of these surveys has been a focus on education systems that have topped the league tables. There's been increasing interest in systems that are shown by PISA results to be succeeding, often both in terms of excellence, in terms of attainment, and in terms of equity, how the background socioeconomic measures can be overcome by education. Finland has, up to now, been the well-known star of this show, but other countries, and indeed individual provinces like Ontario and Canada, have also been the focus of much interest and much policy tourism. So it's understandable why Finland has had to limit the numbers of foreign delegations it can receive as politicians serve the magic bullet. But PISA doesn't really provide an explanation for the flow of traffic between the UK and the US and the apparent policy borrowing between those two countries we are doing things which actually are rather different from Finland or Ontario. Which is puzzling because we both continue to perform embarrassingly badly in many of these league tables. So it can't be that our performance to date justifies the interest we take in each other's reforms. It may, of course, be that our interest in each other's policies is driven by the fact that we are more similar to each other socially and economically than we are to Finland, particularly in our large urban systems. The argument could be that our reforms are more likely to work here than the Finnish ones because the context is more similar. But the mutual interest is probably as much to do with those shared assumptive worlds that I just mentioned, and of course, a common language. So, what are the dominant discourses of reform? I think it's possible to overestimate the extent to which reference to similar substantive policy context is necessary to invoke confidence that similar reforms are being tried elsewhere. As I mentioned, we can see some clear parallels between grant-maintained schools in England and charter schools in the US, and now between charter schools in the US and free schools in England. In these cases, the names are different, but the content is similar. But Gita Steiner-Kamsi argues that the language of reform may sometimes be the same, but the actual content different. Even between the US and the UK, there are cases where the language is similar, but the content significantly, they're not entirely different. So, No Child Left Behind, the key policy in the US, and Every Child Matters in the UK would seem to be evoking similar things. Race to the top and aim higher would similarly appear to be about the same sorts of things. But in both these cases, actually the content of the policies are rather different. The cross-referencing seems to indicate a shared laudable ambition in terms of clearly no child should be left behind, clearly every child matters, clearly we should race to the top and aim higher, perhaps. But it's this laudable ambition rather than shared policy prescription. Gita Steiner-Kamsi herself also argues that policy borrowing, or rather reference to similar practices elsewhere, takes place even when the reforms being talked about are already present in one's own country. In other words, the reference to grant-maintained schools, for instance, in the 1990s was in the context where charter schools were already beginning, and the English example was used to move that forward. And all this points to the conclusion that it is the discursive and legitimatory work that other people's reforms do for your own that is important, rather than that they are necessarily new ideas, or even whether they would actually work in your own context. Yet, that is not how it's often made to appear. One phrase that percolates through much of the education system at both macro policy and classroom level in both countries is the expression, what works. And this also applies within the discourse of policy borrowing. We are encouraged to learn what works from other countries. Indeed, this was the basis of Arne Duncan's recent visit to England, to tell English trade unionists that charter schools work. Superficially, this interest, this international policy interest in what works should be good news for those of us who work in research-intensive university schools of education. However, much of the evidence produced by politicians in support of so-called evidence-informed policy is not what we as researchers would recognise as research. Often, it is quasi-research, carried out by think tanks and advocacy groups.